Joining me now is Liang. She's a professor of economics at Willamette University. Professor, first your reaction to the IMF's outlook and what more we can expect to hear in the next few days.
Good to talk to you, Aline. So indeed, I think the IMF's forecast analysis are really sobering and really paint a very dire, I think, picture. So they talked about how they would, downgrade again the growth forecast. Now is forecasted at 2.7% of growth rate next year, which is lower than their earlier 2.9% of growth rate, and 3.2% this year. And in fact, the IMF managing director said that from now to 2026, the world output is going to shrink, by $4 trillion, which is the size of the German economy. And of course, they talked about the three major forces that cause these kinds of economic sort of slowdown and recession, and one being Russia war. Second is inflation and the higher cost of living. And finally is a slowdown in China, Europe, and many other parts of the world.
So, it's interesting that there's this quote, 2023 will feel like a recession. Do you think we'll actually experience a global recession next year, especially with no end in sight, with so many of the issues that you just mentioned?
Right. So I definitely wanted to be more optimistic, but what the IMF's forecast is that about 1/3 of the GDP, the world GDP, the equivalent size of the 1/3 of the global GDP, will face two consecutive negative growth, which is technically a recession. And on top of that, even if we achieve a positive growth overall, but with the high cost of living and also, many parts of the world are struggling really, with food and energy crises, it definitely will feel like it's in the recession, even if, the growth number is not.
They mentioned China. What are the potential trouble spots for China's economy? Will China meet its growth targets?
Yeah, I think right now, most of the analysts would argue or would predict that 5.5% growth rate is unreachable. Most of the people would, predict lower than that growth rate. The question is how much lower. We have seen numbers as low as 2.8% to some of the 4.5% growth rate. There's a wide range of sort of the forecast. Now, the major, I think, forces that hold China back, as we all know, one has to do with the COVID and the COVID lockdown, the restrictions that are imposed on the economy, especially on mobility, on consumption. That is expected to shed at least 2 percentage points of the GDP growth. And the second has to do with a slowdown in the real estate market. But I think for both sort of the negative forces, there's still a lot of policy considerations behind. And what that means is that if policies do change, then we are likely to see things get improved in China.
So that being said, when it comes to the COVID situation, is there hope that we could see some of those restrictions and lockdowns ease in the coming months, especially when we see travel sort of easing in other parts of the region, with Japan opening up now, Hong Kong allowing people in? And do you think we'll see anything when it comes to the economy come out of the National Party Congress here in the days ahead?
Right. I think that is the trillion-dollar question, isn't it? And I agree. I think a lot of signs that show that the economy is going to gradually relaxing those restrictions. Hong Kong's relaxation right now is 0+0. So, and also there are all these signs where the local governments are actually relaxing their restrictions. When you look at, for example, the eastern province, Zhejiang, which is very close to Shanghai, they now require, mass testing into public venues to only once every week instead of once every 3 days, back in June. So there are signs that there are some relaxation of restrictions, and especially after the Party Congress, I think there's more room for opening up. But I think the most optimistic prediction would say, that easing of the opening would probably start in spring 2023.